The RFx Smoke primitive within the global primitives folder is the particle generator within Vizrt. And when you drag this down, immediately you can see how it creates these particles flowing out of the center point here. Now, it doesn't look like much, it just looks like square pixels at the moment. So the key to making this look like something is using an image. And we're going to go into server here, and we're going to find some type of image that we want to use. Usually it works best with some type of image that has an alpha channel attached to it. So for instance, here's a red flare that we can use. I'm going to drag this onto my RFx Smoke primitive, and when we do that, you can still see that it doesn't look like much. The key to it is clicking on your image, going into the image editor and changing the mapping to vertex. Once we do that, it maps this image onto the RFx Smoke. So now that we go back into the RFx Smoke, basically what we have are a lot of different options that we can kind of fool around with to get the effect that we like. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just merely coming in and messing with a lot of these various options here. So for instance, we have number of particles. It's set to 100 by default. There's a birth rate of 30 and a lifespan of 3. If we want to increase our number of particles here, it's going to increase the rate or number of particles that come out of our center point. There's also a birth rate. When we increase this birth rate here, it's going to increase the speed of the particles coming out. So the only thing you have to watch out for is once we adjust the number of particles or the birth rate, this red number may appear in certain instances and it says 185 required. It's just telling you that for the birth rate to be 61.7 and number of particles needed for that will be 185. So once I adjust this to 185, that number goes away. So now you can continue to work. Some of the options that we have here are spawn. So the spawn, when we change this, we also have our size. So we can change this on the X size. So if I want to spread this particle out, I can. If I also want to make it larger on the Y side, I can spread the Y out, and also we can adjust it on the Z as well. There's a type, so we have a cube, we can change it to sphere. We can also have a container. When we change it to container, it gives us more options underneath this. There's also an image there. So we go back to cube, and it kind of resets this to the default settings that we have before and kept those settings. Next tab we have is impulse, and under impulse we have things such as speed. By default it's set to 50, so we can increase this speed, and when we do that it kind of increases the speed of each individual particle. There's a rotation X, a rotation Z, so now you can see some of these particles are rotating around. There's also an angle X and an angle Z, and this particular option gives us the option to have it locked. If we want to unlock it, now we can adjust the angle X and angle Z individually. There's also a twist here, so we can twist this a little bit more, and there's an align to center button. Once we turn that on, it takes all of these options away from you and aligns all these things right to the center. And you can see in the preview window how it's affecting the particle generator. We have an option here for forces. It's the next tab over. And forces, we have settings such as gravity. It's set to 0 by default. We can increase this. So as we increase this, it pulls the particles down. We also have air resistance. If we increase this, it's going to resist the airflow of these particles. So if we adjust the gravity back down a little bit and have the air resistance set up, we can kind of get these particles to float there like that. If we want to add some turbulence, we can add it on the X, on the Y, and the Z. So as we add this, you can see how it begins to make each individual particle shake or have some turbulence. We can also have the option here for wind, and we have a force here. So we can increase the force. There's a rotation X and a rotation Z within the wind setting as well. So if we reset all these things, we'll go to the next option here, which is size. So we have the option here for birth size. You can see how the particles are starting out small. If we increase the birth size, we can have them start out larger. There's also a death size set to 15 by default. So if we increase this or decrease this, this will set how big they are at the end of their life cycle. There's also a rotation setting. So we have an initial setting. which we can change from the offset into the range, and there's also a spin, so we can add some spin on this as well. There is a color, so if we wanted to change the color over some of these particles, what we have is a color wheel here. So the way this works is that we have these two bars at the end of each color wheel. If we select this, we can now add a color here, and you can see how that changes the particles. Even though we have a reddish image on here, this will add some color into it. So the blue here is at the birth rate, and this other option here is the death rate. So when we increase this to a different color, you can see how that increases that. And if you want to move these sliders around, you can grab them, and if you want to add some colors in between, you can just click right on the color wheel here and highlight each thing and then add some color in between each one. There's also an alpha setting, so we can choose how the alpha affects these. If we want it at the very beginning to be 0 and at the very end to be 100, we can adjust this in between. You can also add alpha points in between this to adjust the alpha. Now if we reset some of these, one more option that we have that I'll show you is our reference container, which is set to container by default. So what this does basically is that I position and keyframe my particle here. What I'm going to do is start it in the upper left. I'm going to move it to the right hand side. Then I'm going to move it to the lower right hand side, back to the left hand side, and back to the beginning point. And when I hit play on my animation, you can see how these particles just kind of float around like that and don't look very realistic. I'm going to go back into my RFx Smoke, and I'm going to change my reference from container to world. And now when I hit play, what it's going to do is change the way this particle flows as it animates around. And you can see how it's kind of creating a trail now instead of just one blob of a mess of particles. So there are a lot of different options that you can come in here and mess around with to get the variations that you need. And there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just a matter of coming in and making adjustments, trying out different settings, and trying out different images. At any point, if you want a different image, you just simply slide it onto your RFX container and it changes out the image.